First of all, good morning, and thank you very much for attending our Forsyth Talk session today. This morning I'm going to be talking about VIOS server maintenance. I do have all of you on mute because I'm recording the session so that we can put it up on our movie site. If you haven't already done so, I have the link here for the handouts, so you can actually go and download those now, and they're a complete copy of what we're going to be talking about. So what we're going to cover is a little bit on best practices setup, some things about the network and VIO servers, a couple of comments on installation, and then we'll actually talk about maintenance and upgrades. And during that time, I'll show you some of the commands on our lab. I've saved one of my VIO servers that has not been updated, so we can do some of these things on it. Additionally, we'll talk about backup and recovery, a little bit about monitoring and file-backed optical, and then there's some other topics, and we'll have a wrap-up, and then I'll turn the recording off, and if there's any questions, I can unmute everybody. So hopefully that works for you. There's also going to be a bunch of things about the HMC in there, because part of best practices is to actually keep your HMC up to date. So with that said, let's start out with some best practices. And the first thing is to stay current. I still hear about people being at VIO server 1.3. Be aware that if you're on anything below 223, you've actually gone end of marketing. End of marketing means we can't get the DVDs or sell the product anymore. So you really want to make sure that you're at least on VIO server 223 or 224. And if you are back level, one of the things we'll talk about is how to get yourself up to date. The very latest release for the VIO server is 2233 Fixed Pack 27 Service Pack 3, which shows up as, if you do an OS level, as AIX61 TL9 SP3. And it does require that your NIM server be upgraded to either 61 TL9 SP3 or 71 TL3 SP3. And that version of AIX is actually the version you need to be at anyway to support Power 8 properly. That fixed pack can be applied to 22.3.0 and higher. And of course you get the updates from Fix Central and the base DVDs you get from your entitled software. And I put both those links in here because people tend to have trouble finding them or remembering what they are. So there's a number of prereqs that you have to check, and I usually use the fixed level reference tool to find those. I've got the links in here for you. There's also a Flirt Lite, which is connected to from that Flirt homepage. That actually provides a whole bunch of tables that are very, very useful, including things like your VIO server to NIM master mapping. There's some system software maps, security and hyper tables, and a number of things like that. And additionally, you also want to make sure that any MPIO drivers that you are running are at the specific release needed for the VIO release. So, and those mappings are on the storage site. So in general, with VIO servers, the first thing I want to say is people are really scared of VIO servers. They don't like to maintain them. When they do update them, they do the minimum that they can. They run their update iOS and they're done. There's a lot of things that you want to keep in mind, and there are things that you should be doing on your VIO servers as part of what I'd call good hygiene practice. The first thing is just keep things simple. Don't go doing all kinds of crazy things. There's a lot of things you can't do on a VIO server, including run it as a NIM server and a bunch of other things. It's an AIX appliance. It's not an AIX LPAR. You also want to make sure that the logical memory block size is the same on all servers. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to that as the memory region option, or MRO. But basically, if you want to use live partition mobility, that has to be the same on all the servers that you're LPMing. So the best thing is to come up with a size, and whenever you get a new server, make sure it is set to that size. In order to change it, you have to go into the ASMI and you have to completely power off the server. You also want to use hot pluggable adapters rather than the built-in ones, or at least mirror the built-in ones to hot pluggable ones, because obviously if you lose one of the built-in adapters, that's going to be a problem for you because you can't hot plug it. I always use dual VIO servers. That way I can update one VIO server while the other one's still running my business. That allows for concurrency and redundancy. And I always set the adapters to desired, not required. That way, if I lose one of my fiber adapters, my LPAR will still boot, and usually I have 2 fiber adapters in there. Not mixing multipath drivers and HBAs, that gets everybody confused. And the stuff I haven't read is probably really critical, backing up regularly. I don't care if you use NIM, if you write your own scripts. The examples I have in here will use scripts. But you need to make sure that you're backing up, not just to a makes speed, but you also have to make sure that you're backing up all of the settings, which is a different kind of backup that we'll talk about. I use HMC Scanner to before and after any changes that I make to the servers. You can use sysplan if you want. I just happen to like HMC Scanner better. And you should plan on doing at least one update a year. IBM normally puts out 2. They have a whole maintenance schedule all the way out to 2016, I think it is, published now. But you should actually make sure that you are getting these done. Some people like to separate VIOs for production and non-production. That's not a bad idea because it lets you update your non-production VIOs first. And obviously you have to test things like failover. The first thing I do once I bring up a VIO pair and some LPARs is I shut down the primary VIO to see what happens. Then when it comes back up, if I haven't lost anything, I bring the other VIO down, just to make sure that what I think I built in for redundancy really is there. You want to use the VIO version of the commands rather than OEM setup N wherever possible. This is particularly important with upgrades. You should never go into SMIDI to add file sets or remove file sets. That should always be done using the VIO version of the commands. Obviously you want to mirror your VIO root VG if it's on internal disk, making sure that you check the error reports. A lot of times people don't do that and things show up there. A couple of other things that a lot of people don't realize is that VIO servers, and particularly the network, scales based on entitlement, not on VPs. So you need to make sure that you're not running at 100% of your entitlement, or worse, 120. You need to make sure it's high enough and that you have enough VPs and memory to grow. And the thing that affects your memory is the high-performance adapters, 10 gig adapters, 8 gig fiber adapters. Those actually will require you to potentially have more memory in your VIO server. The VIOS advisor will actually let you know if it doesn't think you have enough memory. I usually have a spreadsheet that I use to calculate what I think the memory requirement may be, and then that's what I put into my planning document. I may not give it, let's say it says 11 gig, I may not give it 11 gig to start, but I'll always reserve that memory in case I need it later. Also note that version 2 of the VIO server requires at least 30 gig in root VG, plus whatever you want for page space. So if you've been running very, very skinny root VGs and you've been stand booting, this is something you need to think about. So a lot of people boot the VIO servers from internal disk. I typically do. And one of the rules about paging is you never ever have 2 page spaces on the same LUN, whether it's internal or external disk, but when it's internal it's even worse because they could end up at different ends of the disk. What's interesting is that by default, and it has not been fixed because I just completely installed a fresh VIO server at the latest level, your VIO will be installed with 2 page datasets on the same LUN. So my HDisk 0 comes up with a 512 meg HD6 and a 1.5 gig paging 00. You never want your VIO server to page, but if it does end up doing some paging, you certainly don't want it paging to 2 page datasets on the same LUN. So if you look down here, you can see that this VIO server is paging and they're on the same HDisk, and I can tell you that that's an internal disk. This is a really bad situation. So what I normally do is I increase HD6 to at least 4 gig and I get rid of paging 00. And then if I happen to add some additional disk for file-backed optical, I may put a second page space on there. But obviously the first plan is to try to avoid any kind of paging. I also go in and I set up the dump devices because if something does go wrong with my VIO server, I want to be able to get a dump for IBM. So you can run the sysdump dev-e. It gives you an estimate in bytes of what the correct size would be. You divide that down to figure out what that ends up being in terms of your volume group size. So if your volume group PPs are 512 meg, then obviously this would be 32 times 512 meg. Then you allocate the dump devices. I also set up logging because by default on AIX and the VIO server, logging is not set up, the only thing you'll see is this user.info, user.debug for LPM. You don't have to set yours up like mine, but you should set up some kind of logging. And then you need to obviously touch those log files and stop and start the syslog daemon. I don't log to /var if I can help it. If /var fills up, the system goes down. So I normally create a new file system called /userlocallogs. Doesn't matter what you call it, just make sure that it's a separate file system so that if it fills up, you're not blowing out /var or /usr, which will take your system down. Then we have some tuning things. I typically make the same kind of tuning changes that I would make on AIX. But in particular for VIO servers, some of the fiber adapter settings are very important. So that would be num command elms, which is the equivalent of Q depth for a fiber adapter, and then the max transfer size, which is the DMA size. So I always increase those depending on what you have as back-end storage. I usually actually set them to 2048, but all my back-end storage is B7000 XIV. Assuming that you have something that supports it, I would go to 2048. If you don't have something that supports it, you may end up at 1024 or 512. The default is 200, and that, if you've got a busy system, that will not be enough. If you're running NPIV, you also need to set that on the client LPARs, and don't make the mistake of setting it on the clients and then not setting it on the VIO server. If the client is higher than the VIO server, the client will not boot. You will also want to pay attention to the Q depth settings on the HDisks and so on, but for the purposes of this, that's all in the AIX performance tuning session that we already have up. And additionally, you want to pay attention to adapter layout and priorities, because that can make a big difference in performance. And we've got a slide coming up on that. So this is just some notes on adapter tuning, showing you what the defaults are for max transfer size and num command elms. And then if you bump this to the max transfer size to 0x2, that gets you a 128 meg DMA, which is the area that's used for the actual data I/O. And then here's my num command elms here. So, and I have examples here of the commands to change those for the fiber adapters. I use the -P because this is unfortunately a change that either requires that you rmdev all the disk and rmdev the adapters and then make the change, or you can simply do a -P and do a reboot, which is what I normally do. As of AIX 61TL2, your virtual fiber channels are always going to use this 128 meg DMA, even if you don't change the max transfer size, but I change it anyway so that everything matches up. And there's a very, very good article by Dan Braden from IBM on tuning these adapters, so I would highly recommend you go read that. So this is what I currently have on my VIO servers and my NPIV clients, how I happen to have a couple of my LPARs set. I had mentioned that adapter priorities affect performance. So here's an example for a 770C model, and basically here's all my slots and my disks in the top kick, the second kick, and then here's my I/O drawer. So I've listed here the actual priorities. You can get these out of the Technical Overview Red Book for your particular box. And went through and we allocated the actual adapters by slot depending on the priority for that LPAR. So you can see LPAR 1 was a pretty high priority LPAR, actually higher priority than the VIOs. That's because it was the bread and butter LPAR and it was not virtualized. And then the VIOs got everything else. So we tried to make sure that our fiber adapters were ahead of our network adapters and so on. And then we spread out the disk. You'll notice that VIO1 had a disk in the top node and in the second node. Remember, each node has 2 3-packs. That way, when we did the root VG mirror, it was across 2 kicks. So if we lost a kick, we still were able to keep our VIOs up. And the same with, if you look at VIO1, it took a network adapter from the second kick and a network adapter from the first kick, and then we did the same sort of thing with the fiber. So making sure that we had as much redundancy built in as well as the performance being based on the priorities. There are similar spreadsheets out there for the D models, for the new power rates and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that you should think about doing. Now I mentioned memory planning, and the reason that memory planning has become important is that the actual overhead for memory is dependent on the maximum memory setting, not on the desired memory setting. So starting Power 7 Plus, I think this division goes to 128, but we'll leave it at 64 for now. So you can see here that it takes my maximum memory setting. It actually comes up with what the overhead would be in meg for each of those LPARs, because you have to round it up to your logical memory block size. On top of that, each of your 8 gig and 10 gig of high-performance adapters has an overhead. If you're using MPIV, it's 140 megabytes per VFC adapter per client. If you're using vSCSI, then the numbers are different. So in my case, I was using MPIV and I had some other built-ins. What that meant was that although when I added up the desired memory, I needed 164 gig, in fact, I needed an additional 16 here, 16 meg for overhead. My actual overhead total was 6 gig, purely based on the maximum memory sizes. So right away it's 164 plus 6, which is 170. But then on top of that, I need the extra memory for the high performance ports and for the MPIV stuff. So when you start to add that up, it could be as much as 11 gig. And by the way, this memory here that I'm looking at for the MPIV stuff should be added into the desired memory for that LPAR in order to make sure it has enough. So for the VIO servers, technically each one of these needs probably 7 or 8 gig. Now the reality is you probably wouldn't run them with 7 or 8 gig, you'd start them out maybe with 4, but reserve 7 or 8 so that you can grow them as you need to. So just be aware that those high performance adapters do require some additional memory, and you need to be prepared for that. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people would have gone on board activated 164 gig when they really needed more like 178 or 180. So it's something to keep in mind. Now for virtual Ethernet, a couple of things. I see people using nib quite often, and I see people are nervous about SDA failover. And the reason that they use nib is because they want to have redundancy across switches. What I do is I have my primary VIO on one switch, my secondary VIO on the other. And the reason I do that is because then I can have 2 network ports aggregated on VIO1, both on the same switch, 2 network ports aggregated on VIO2, both on the same switch. With SEA failover, I can use the full bandwidth of both of those ports on VIO1, and if it goes down, I have the full bandwidth of all those ports on VIO2. So I'm always able to use 2 of the ports. If I was using nib, I would have the bandwidth of 1 port and the other 3 would be failover, because I'd have 1 port on VIO1 that was SEA failover to VIO2 and the other 2 would be nib. So pretty much I'm wasting 3 out of my 4 ports, whereas with SEA failover, I get the bandwidth of 2 of the 4. Additionally, nib is very, very pingy. It's always pinging to check, so you get a lot more network traffic. So I'm a big fan of SEA failover, where I have VIO1 on one switch, VIO2 on the other. And with some of the newer switches, there are ways around even having to do that. I already mentioned paying attention to entitlement. Virtual Ethernet in particular, the performance scales by entitlement, not virtual processors. And that has a lot to do with just the nature of virtual Ethernet, the fact that since there's not a real card there, the server is using CPU to do everything. So it's going to be more of a draw on your system. So really pay attention to entitlements in your VIO servers. If you have split your VIO servers so that you have all your networking handled by one pair of VIOs and all your virtual SCSI and MPIV handled by another, then you can improve your network performance by disabling network threading on the virtual Ethernet. But you should only ever do that if the VIO server is only handling the network. And then, of course, turning on large send on your virtual Ethernets and on your SEA. And I have some more on that coming up. I have a section on the network because there's been so much confusion on setting up 10 gig networking. By default, I don't care whether it's an AIX system or a VIO, your network is detuned. It's actually tuned for a 10 to 100 meg network. So one of the things that you want to do is set these tunables here. In the AIX performance session, I go into these in a lot more detail, but basically these are the values you should be using for RFC 1323 and the TCP and UDP send and receive. These are at least starting point values. You may need to go higher depending on what your network traffic is like. You need the RFC 1323 equals 1 in order to have TCP send and receive with more than 64K. And up there we're setting it to 256. So also you need to check the NIC interfaces with ifconfig and make sure that either they're not set to anything, which means they will default to with the settings we set here, or if they are set to something, that they're set to at least this. And the ones you'll see there are the RFC and the TCP setting. So if I do an ifconfig on my VIO server SEA, I'll see that my TCP send is set to 262, my TCP receive is set to 262, and my RFC is there. That's the stuff that you're looking for. And in fact, yeah, this is the one that I have right now that we're going to be upgrading later. You can see my EN6, which is my SEA, and here's my settings just here. So I have a couple of notes on valid adapters. This is really just for your own interest, but if you're running 770s, they come with multi-function cards. There's two different kinds, and there's one of these per node. There's one with the new copper SFP Plus. That's an active twisted pair. It is not a standard twisted pair. I bring that up because there's also some new SFP Plus cards starting with the C models of the 770s. Those SFP Plus cards require very, very specific IBM cables. They come in 1 meter, 3 meter, and 5 meter, and they're very specific active twin-X cables. They don't support any other cables. So if you do want to do SFP Plus, you need to make sure that wherever you put the server, you can get to within a 5 meter run to the network switch that you're connecting to. Now the SR is your standard fiber, and that is what most people are running for their 10 gig E. I have a whole bunch of information that IBM has up at this website for the 770s, but just be aware that there are actually 3 different kinds of cards from a 10 gig point of view. There's the SR, which is standard fiber. There is the LR, which I've never seen anybody buy, and then there's the SFP Plus, which is this new active copper twin-X. And again, like I said, you need specific cables for that. With the Power 8, there are some new adapters, and I bring this up because it turns out that right now on the 10 gig adapters, NIM is not supported. So if you're planning on doing a pure 10 gig network, you need to make sure that you actually do the fiber channel over Ethernet adapter, which is listed down the bottom. That does support NIM. And all you do is ignore the whole fiber channel over Ethernet part and just use it as a 10 gig port for the network. And that's what I'm doing right now, and NIM installs just fine over it. But just be aware that the Power 8s, there are these 4 adapters that come that do not support NIM. If you're doing the standard 2-port 10 gig E adapter, that one does. In terms of network performance and throughput, it's going to depend on your CPU power, your MTU size, distance between receiver and sender, and so on. And one of the reasons I'm bringing up the network stuff is because there is so much confusion over 10 gig E setup. So I wanted to add a little bit in here. We do have a network performance tuning session up on the movie site. A little bit of information in here. So the things that you can do is you can use jumbo frames. Obviously you have to coordinate that with the network team because you're changing the MTU size, and everything end-to-end has to be jumbo frames. Where I see people use it mostly is when they're actually using virtual Ethernet between 2 LPARs, and it never goes outside the box. But you definitely want to do it there. And to give you an example, they did some benchmarks a while back that showed that if you went from an MTU of 1500 to jumbo frames, which is the 9000, on a virtual Ethernet between 2 LPARs, you pretty much halve the CPU overhead for that virtual Ethernet. So it's definitely something to think about. But don't go just changing it because if you're going outside the box, because everything all the way through, right down to the firewalls, has to be changed. Some other things you need to be aware of. Going from 1 gig to 10 gig does not give you 10 times the performance. You're going to need new cables. You want to get good quality cables, not the cheap $1 or whatever cables. You are going to use some more CPU and memory because the network traffic is going to be buffered, and when network traffic gets buffered, somebody is buffering it. It gets buffered in memory and the CPU handles it. So just be prepared for that. And this particularly applies to the SEA and the VIO server. So if you're running a 10 gig E there, just be aware that you're going to need some more memory and some more CPU. That's one of the reasons why they actually have that calculation for what the additional overhead would be. You also need to make sure that if all the ports that you have out there that are set for 10 gig were actually running 10 gig, can your switch actually handle that? And of course, does the server have enough CPU left to deliver that data? Not much point in having a 10 gig network if the CPU doesn't have enough gas. Some other tips on 10 gig E, using flow control everywhere. What flow control will do is make sure that you don't flood the network, and therefore that stuff will go end to end without a lot of retransmissions. TCP offload, setting large send and large receive. These can make a big difference. You have to set it on the virtual Ethernet, on the SEA, and so on. There's in multiple places you have to set these things. The other thing to keep in mind is you should not use ifconfig to make these changes. ifconfig does not update the ODM, so if you reboot the server, all those changes go away. And we've already talked about low CPU entitlement. You may want to do some testing. If you're going to do testing, FTP is not a valid way to test bandwidth because it's single-threaded. You're probably going to want to use something like netperf or iperf. If it's web-based, you may want to use HTTperf. But basically, if you want to make sure that you're getting 10 gig E connectivity, then you're going to want to do some kind of a benchmark. And so these will be valid things to use to test it. There is a limit, and there's a paper by Alexander Paul on this. There is a limit in the for the virtual Ethernet speed within the hypervisor of about 0.5 to 1.5 gigabits a second, depending. But that is per VM. So every VM could be sending and receiving at that Ethernet speed concurrently. Just one VM will be limited somewhat. So keep that in mind, that the bandwidth of the 10 gig E is going to be based on all of the VMs, not if you're only running one. And then a couple of other things to look into. I'm not a switch person, but you can do some things with SEA failover performance by setting port fast trunk on switch ports and activating dead gateway detection and so on. But obviously this is all the kind of thing that you want to test in a lab before you go start changing things, or at least talk to your network people about these as options. There were also some changes when 223 came out. There were a significant number of changes in general. But one of the things that they changed was how you set up the SEAs. So if you look at the traditional setup, when we did our make VDev, we had to explicitly specify a control channel, which had to be on a different VLAN and so on. Also, I have a note here that do not screw up your priorities and do not forget your control channel in this setup, or you will cause a spanning tree loop. And spanning tree loops are very bad things. Now with 223, and they go into this in great detail in Chapter 4 of the Red Book on the enhancements, they've simplified the setup. So what they've done is, as long as your HMC is at 778 and your firmware is at 780 or higher, they've now reserved VLAN 4095 for internal management traffic. So when you set up an SEA, you don't have to allocate a dedicated control channel anymore. If you allocate one, it will use it. If you don't allocate one, it will let the SEA pairs share VLAN 4095 within the same virtual switch. So that's something to keep in mind, obviously something to test separately. And it also tells you that you should not be using VLAN 4095 for anything else. So that's something that's changed with 223 of the VIO server. We're going to talk about a couple of things on installation, and then we'll go into actually doing an upgrade. So you can actually do your installations from DVD. You can do your installations using NIM. In order to use NIM, for installations, you need to actually create a make-sysv target. Now, to install with NIM, you obviously have to create a spot. That spot has to actually be created from the VIO server make-sysv image on the VIO server install disks. You cannot treat it like a regular AIXL par, where you create an LPP source and then you create the spot from the LPP source. You also should never update the spot from an LPP source. So the only way to create the spot is directly from those make-sysv images. You have to get your NIM master up to the right level, which, as I said, for 2233 is AIX61TL9SP3 or 71TL3SP3. NIM actually has an update iOS command now, and that's what you should be using if you want to actually update the VIO server. And then on your NIM master, you can also use alt disk install, and you can use nim-o alt disk, etc., etc. If you're not using NIM to update or install your VIOS, then you should be using the update iOS or the alt-root VG command from padmin to update a VIO server. You should never go into SMTI to update a VIO server. That is a very, very bad practice. So in order to do an install from NIM, what you would do is you would need both of the DVDs for the VIO server, and there are now 3 MakeSysB images as of 2.2. 2 of them are on the first DVD, and the third one is on the second DVD. So I copy all 3 images to a directory, which means I use loop mount or I mount the DVD depending on how I have things set up, because I usually just download the ISO images. I then use cat to combine them. So here I cat MakeSysB image 2, and MakeSysB image 3 into a new MakeSysB. I then define that to the NIM master, and then I define my spot with the source being that combined MakeSysB. You also take the BOSINST data from the VIO server DVD, and you use that to create a VIO server BOSINST resource. Now you can do a MakeSysB install of a VIO server using BOSINST. The nice thing is that if you have a MakeSysB of a VIO that you want to put out there, you can also do updates from this spot and so on. So that's pretty much some basics on using NIM. Now we're going to go into a lot more detail on maintenance and upgrades. I have an order that I tend to do things in, and the reason for that is that I run into too many problems if I do it any other way. So I normally will upgrade my HMC first, then my firmware, then my VIO server, and then AIX. Having said that, I download the READMEs for each level that I'm planning on going to, and I read them all. And I never used to do that, but I've learned over time that if you don't read them, it's a great way to screw things up. Particularly, there were cases where people would not upgrade the HMC first, and it turned out that there was a bug in the service processes that if you didn't upgrade the HMC first and you upgraded the servers at firmware and then did an LPM, you completely corrupted the VIOS, the service processor. So now I read those READMEs and I read the tarts that say the things that you absolutely have to do before you do anything else. I think that's very important for you to keep in mind. I also download the updates, and then I go into fixed level requirement tool and I cross-check for all the compatibility just to make sure I haven't missed anything. And then I double-check that README. I always run ERRPT, make sure there's no problems, check if there's no stale partitions, missing disks or paths. That's really important. And I also make sure that my paths are redundant, because obviously if I'm going to do one VIO server and reboot it, while the other one is supposedly going to stay up, it would actually be nice if that was the case. So that's just some prep work I do before I even start. Then I run HMC scan or assist plan, I back up my VIO server, I mount the NFS file system or whatever that I'm going to use for the update. I typically have it in NFS and I copy it locally so that I'm updating locally. If my NFS goes away, I'm not halfway through an update and breaking things. But however you want to do it. Now that's all the prep work. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, because obviously not everybody's at the same version. There are different levels that you're going to be migrating to. If you want to migrate to version 2, firstly your HMC has to be at version 7, and I think the minimum level now is 7.7.4. If your VIO server is lower than version 2.1, you've got to migrate to version 2 using the migration DVD. With that said, you can't always do that. So, as an example, if you are at a level that is prior to version 1.3, you're going to basically be doing a reinstall. You can migrate from version 3 or version 1.4, but the way you do that is first you have to go to version 1.5. Specifically, they want you to get to 1526 FP 11.1 Service Pack 2 before you upgrade to version 2. Depending on which document you read and which one it was published, I've seen documents that just say 1.5. I've seen others specifically list that service pack. So I would say it's a safe bet you need to actually get to that service pack. Then once you get to 1.5, now you can actually do the migration. So all the stuff prior to this migration is really updates. You can do it from an NFS mount and use update iOS, etc. Once you're going from 1.5 to 2.1, you will actually be doing a migration, which means you're going to boot from the DVD and SMS mode and tell it to do a migration upgrade. So think of it as like when you go from version 5 of AIX to version 6 or version 6 of AIX to version 7, that's the one where you boot it from the DVD. Or however, whatever you boot from, whether it's NIM or whatever. So once you get to 2.1, now you can update to 2.2.3.1. So this is pretty much a multi-step update if you're way back level. So there is a single-step update you can do, but your VIO has to be at 2.2.1.1 or higher. At that point, you can go straight to 2.2.3.3. There is a way to get around it using a single merged LPP source. They go into that in great detail in this managing and monitoring book. But if you're using something like STD-PCM, that's not going to work. Once you get to version 2.1, then everything's update iOS from there. And again, if you're using shared storage pools, there are some specific concerns about things you have to do before the updates. These are spelled out in the Red Book, and they're also spelled out very specifically in the READMEs, which is another reason why you read the READMEs. If we look at what we do to update, so I'll show you with my VIO server right now. I'm currently at 2.2.3.2. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually commit any updates. And I don't have any because I kind of got ahead of myself. Then the next, it would help if I could spell. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure that there are no outstanding e-fixes on, because if there are e-fixes on, they're going to have to come off. So it turns out I don't have any e-fixes, so I don't have to worry about that. And the kind of thing that would be an e-fix is a lot of people put on that SSL patch just recently. That may have been an e-fix depending on how you put it on. All right, so now we go run a whole bunch of checks, because what we want to make sure of is that we have a healthy VIO server before we update it. So we already did the iOS level, so we know we're at 2.2.3.2. We're going to do a DF, and I like the G because I think in gig, and just make sure that nothing is completely full, that we're not going to have any problems with the updates. I also do an OS level -S to see where I'm coming from. If you ever see 6100-00-00-0000, stop right there, because that means that you're missing some file sets, and those really should be cleaned up before you go any further. So this connects command will help you identify those. This is going to look at all the TLs, even though they call them MLs here. And what you want to find out, what you don't want to see is one that says not all file sets for. In this case, all of them were found, so we're good. If you do the LPP check-V, what that's looking for is any LPPs that don't check out. And then if you want to be extra paranoid, which I always am, you can actually say, well, I know I'm at 6100-09-02-1412. Show me any file sets that are lower than that level. All right, and then, of course, we do our ERRPT. So those are the checks that I do before I do anything with my VIO server, and I'll show you some examples later on where I actually found some stuff that was bad and what I had to do to fix it. So the next thing I do is I run a backup. Now it happens I have one set up already, so I'll show you the script. So in here what I'm actually doing is I'm just running a bunch of commands. If you do the su -padmin -c and then stick everything behind an ioscl, you can run this stuff as root, but it runs as padmin. So I save a whole bunch of ls-devs and things like that. So we're going to run that script, and it's going to get an error because the directory is already there. So if I now do an ls-l admin, save it. These are all the files. So there's, I saved the status of the disks and all that kind of stuff there. And that's what this is showing you here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to back up. We use the VIOS BR to do that. So I'm just getting that set up now. And I save that into the same directory. And that's going to back up 5 files. Actually, when you run the save VG struct, it's actually going to do that anyway. But I always do a separate backup of it. And then I can do a VIOS BR-view of that file. So if I now look at home, padmin, save it, you'll see, so we can now do like a VIOS BR dash, I think it's dash view dash file. And this is the stuff that the VIOS BR saves for you. So it's really the layout, what things go where, what your IPs are, where they're assigned, and so on. It saves a whole lot of information for you. The other thing that I do is I run an LSVG. In this case, I only have root VG, but sometimes I'll have my, if I'm doing any local root clients or anything like that, they may be in a different volume group, so I'd also save the VG structures for that. And then I'm going to run my actual backup, so we'll get that typed in. And I do this basically using the SU to padmin. Here you can see that it's just running the backup, and then it will take a while to run that backup. This actually takes a full makes a speed type backup. Here I'm actually copying it to user local backups, which in my case is an NFS mount from my NIM server, so I actually have the backup on my NIM server, and the dash makes this B flag makes it bootable. I then go to Fix Central and download the fixes. I downloaded 2233 Fix Pack 27 Service Pack 3. It came down as one ISO. I then loop mounted that on my NIM server and used SMIDI BFF create to create a directory that I put all the files in for it. So while my backup's running, I'll show you that on what I ended up with on my locals on one of my other servers. I've actually updated 3 VIOs and I saved one for today. So what that SMIDI BFF create creates me a directory that has all of this in it. And what I'm going to do is when I do my update iOS, I'm going to point it to that directory. So right now my VIO server is still backing up, but what I would normally do is run the update iOS -accept -install and point it at this directory that I made local. The first thing you'll see is you'll get the preview, and at the end it'll say that it's going to install boss.rt.install, and that there are, in this case I think it was 172 deferreds. So typically when you do an AIX update, the first thing it does is install boss.rt.install, and then it goes back and installs all the deferreds. In the case of a VIO server, it prompts you for the boss.rt.install. You reply yes, it installs that, then it goes back and it tells you what it's going to do and prompts you for that. Whereas with the standard AIX upgrade, it doesn't do that. It prompts you for the boss.rt install and then goes ahead, does that and does everything. So this way you get to say yes twice. Alright, so it goes through and installs boss.rt install. Then it's going to prompt you about installing the other 272 fixes. And at the end, it's going to show you all the estimated space and free space. Obviously, if you don't have enough free space, you're going to go and fix that. And then you can go ahead and do the actual install. Once the install's finished, that's when I always do an LSPV. And so here I did my LSPV. My root VG is HDisk 0, HDisk 1. Even though during the update they actually do a boss boot, since I don't trust anybody, I do a boss boot myself and a boot list, and then I do my reboot. And then after that, I do all my post-install testing. So all the stuff we did earlier, these post-install checks, I do them again. So I will do my iOS level again. I'll do my OS level -S. So you can see that 2233 is actually AIX 61 TL9 SP3, which is the highest level of AIX version 6 right now. I'll rerun my instafix and do the grep of ML, and then obviously I'll do things like an ERRPT and so on. So this gives you an idea of the things that you'll be looking at. So once these are passed and the second VIO server, and I always do my secondary VIO server first. Once that's done, then I go and I do my primary. And you shouldn't leave time between them. I typically will do them both the same day because I don't want to run into problems where the two versions are incompatible. Okay, so I mentioned that you can have problems. So you do your iOS level, and it tells you that it's 223 something. It may or may not match where you want it to go. But then you go into OEM setup env and you do this OS level -s and you see this. Or something that doesn't match what you should expect to see, because if you're at 2233, it should say 61TL9 SP3. So even if this came back and said 610009-01, since I know it should be SP3, I want to know why. So I run the instafix and I see that not all the file sets for TL8 are on. So you've got a bunch of things you can do. I start with an OS level -SQ and it lists all the known service packs. Now there's a lot of them. So I put them here for you. So you can see here, there's a lot of known service packs. So the ones up the top are the ones that matter. So let's say it stopped at 0805, it stopped at 0903, but over here it's telling me that it is at 6100. That tells me already that there's an issue. So then you can, so let's say that you expected it to come up at 610008. You can run the OS level -S command with the -L with that. And in this case, this is going back a little while, but this is what I saw, that the alt disk install boot images was a problem, and there was also an issue with the Spanish lock UTF. So you've got a couple of options. What a lot of people have done, which is not the correct way to fix this, is they have gone into OEM setup env, they've gone into SMIDI, and they've either removed or updated them. You should either remove them or update them, depending on what they are, but the way to do it is to use update iOS. So let's say there's a problem with boss.suma and you want to remove it. You can do an update iOS -remove space boss.suma. You could do an update iOS -remove boss.lock.utf ESES. You could find out what the missing file sets are, put them into a directory like I did here called user localsoft missing, run nutalk, and then do an update iOS. You'll have to do the commit first. Then you could do an update iOS -accept install dev / user localsoft missing. I've actually had to do that before because there were some file sets that just didn't come across. So I did grab those file sets from my AIX DVD and put them into a directory and used update iOS to update them. That's stuff to keep in mind. The other thing is if you do find that there are e-fixes, like let's say you ran the -P and it listed this IV46869M3A, then number one, you need to find out what that e-fix is for and whether or not there's a replacement for it at the version you're going to. But secondly, you will need to remove it before you put any maintenance on. So this is a command to remove one. All right, so that's some of the basics of just doing upgrades and maintenance. Hopefully that was clear. If you do have any questions, you can type them in the chat and I'll try to answer them as we go. So now let's talk a little bit about backup and recovery. So I already showed you the viosbr command for using for a backup, and that's really going to back up the definitions for your user-defined virtual resources. You can use the same command to view them and the same command to restore them, and I've given you the link here for the viosbr. There's a whole bunch of syntax around it. I always back up to an NFS file system, but you can back up to tape, you can back up to DVD, you can back up to whatever you need to back up to. I can do my backup iOS -file /backup to the VIOSA. Now this is the backup that I use when I'm using NIM. This creates a NIM resources tar package, and I can use that later on to clone VIO servers. I can also back it up as a makesysb file that's restorable, and that's what the backup iOS with the -makesysb flag does. So you should try it both ways in so you can see the differences. All right, as you saw, I run my VIO save script. I do this before I do any makesysb backups. And I'll also do things, I'll run an LSVG, and if I have other volume groups, then obviously I save the VG structures, and then I run my VIOS backup, then I run the actual backup, and that's what you saw me doing before. And in fact, we are still running our backup here, because it's quite a large backup. So this is the script that I run for my VIO save shell. So I do an iOS level, I do an LSDF type disk adapter, VPD slots. Pretty much I'm getting as much information as I can. An LSMAP minus all, an LSMAP minus all minus MPIV. I run all these just so that I've got everything documented. And then here I keep track of all my VIO disks, doing an lsdev-dev, hdisk1-adder. So I get all the attributes that I have set for those disks, just because I can never remember anything. So at least if I have it documented like that, it's not hard for me to go and recreate it. Now, when we look at monitoring our VIO servers, there's obviously standard monitoring, whether it's nmon or whether you're running some monitoring tool, but there's also some things that you want to look at. So as an example, one of the things that I see all the time on VIO servers in particular, but anywhere there's virtual Ethernet, is packet issues that are caused by some buffers that a lot of people aren't aware of. So if you do a netstat-v and you go down to your shared Ethernet adapter or a virtual Ethernet, and you see like some packets dropped, and you also see no resource errors. And they don't have to be identical. They may not exactly match, but they're kind of close. Then there's another thing that you need to check, and I call them the tiny etc. buffers. So if you keep scrolling down, you may see hypervisor receive failures. So this is actually an example from one of the VIOs that I did some work on. I had a lot of packets dropped. It was pretty much matched my no resource errors, which matched my hypervisor receive failures. And that's because I didn't have enough memory reserved to vent the buffer space for the workload. So I scrolled down further and I found these virtual trunk statistics, and you'll see that there's min-max buffers and there's max allocated. So what you want to look at is there any point that my max allocated is equal to or comes close to my max buffers? So obviously for my tiny buffers here, they're equal, which tells me that I've run out of buffers. So what we would do here is we would do a chdev on the virtual Ethernet, and we would increase the tiny. Actually, I've got it wrong here. This should be the max buff tiny and the min buff tiny. So the point being that you need to check if this max equals max allocated or even comes close, then you need to bump up those buffers. And this will require a reboot to fix. You can use nstat-d on the VIOs, or you can do a netstat-v. It gets you the same information. So I also run nmon. I run at 724 on my VIOs and all my LPARs. And what I do is I have a directory that's its own file system called user local perf, and all my nmons just get saved in there. But you could do it however you want. You can also do the same thing with Topaz. I use all these flags. If you're not using Workload Manager, which you won't be on a VIO server, you can drop the capital W. This is a 30-minute snap. This one down here is the one I run for 24 hours. So I take 576 snaps, 150 seconds apart, and I'm basically grabbing everything. What's nice is the capital O gets you the SEA statistics on your VIO server. And you get page space and disk service times and fiber adapter stats and so on. So you get a lot of information. You'll also find that the VIO Server Performance Advisor actually reports on the VIO servers as well, on the SEAs, sorry, as well. There's a couple of licensed program products you may be interested in. One is the Dynamic Platform Optimizer. This is really useful on the multi-node systems like the 770 and above. And basically, its purpose is to try to improve affinity for memory and processor placement. So as an LPAR gets bigger, it may get spread across multiple nodes, which is not a good thing. You know, it may have some of its CPUs on the first kick and some on the second, and memory spread across them. What DPO tries to do, if you put it in management mode, is to take care of compressing that down so that things are as close as possible. So there are operating system versions that are what they call DPO aware, and those are listed here. So any changes that are made by DPO will actually be automatically reflected in the LPAR. If DPO needs to change other ones, you'll have to reboot those LPARs after running DPO for the changes to come in. The other one is Dynamic System Optimizer. So DPO is system-wide. Dynamic System Optimizer is LPAR-wide. So within the LPAR, this is going to try to do some tuning for you. I typically do my own tuning on my LPARs, so I don't tend to use it, but it's definitely something that you should look at, and I've given you references here to a white paper and also to a red book. You can also do shared processor pool monitoring. What you have to do is on all of your LPARs, you need to go and turn on the allow processor performance collection. So the way you find out if that's on is you go to the LPAR properties when the LPAR's it has to have been booted the first time, and you'll see a box here, allow performance information collection. That has to be checked. The good news is that's a dynamic change, so as soon as you check it, that change becomes activated. And then of course you have LPAR stats and the NMON with a P and so on. So you should try all of these, see which one works the best for you. But you will only get proper pool statistics if that allow performance information collection set on every LPAR. So if you look in the NMON Analyzer at the LPAR tab, this is going to give you the information on shared pool utilization. So down here is my LPAR, this is everybody else, and this is the parts of the pool that are not being idle. Be very careful not to overcommit your pool. If you overcommit your pool, then the LPARs are going to spend a lot of time fighting with each other. Okay, as part of any VIO server maintenance, I actually use file-backed optical. If for no other reason than I tend to lose DVDs. So I take every DVD and I rip it to an ISO image, and I upload all the ISO images, actually to my NIM server, and then every primary VIO has an extra disk that I use for file-backed optical. I create a repository and I load those DVDs. So what I can then do is any of the LPARs beneath them can actually mount those ISO images as if they were a DVD. This is very useful because you can't float the DVDs anymore. So if you have something that you have to get off a DVD, you can upload it as an ISO into file-backed optical and then allocate that, and it just looks like /dev/DD. So I typically add a third disk to each VIO server and put a repository in there. And you can put MakeThisBe images in there, by the way. So if I wanted to look at that, let me see. Let me find one that actually has a file-backed optical repository. I think my Power 8 does. What you're going to do is you're going to create a volume group. So if you look at, this is my Power 8. If you look here, I don't know why the HDisk got messed up, but HDisk 0 is actually FBO-VG. That's what I called it instead of data VG. So I created a volume group specifically for that. I never put it in root VG because I really don't want to make my MakeThisBes huge. Then you actually make a repository and create something a particular size. So here I created my repository on FBO-VG. And if I actually was to do a DF, you would actually see this var VIO VM library. That's what it creates as your repository. So it should do. And it so happens that mine is 500 gig on my Power 8 because I gave it a whole disk. You can then run the make vopt, and what I'm doing here is I'm saying take this ISO image from this NFS mount and load it into my repository so that I can use it. And that makes it available to be allocated to LPARs. So if I look into that directory, you'll see that I have my AIX61 base DVD 1 and 2. I try to give them meaningful names because I can never remember what I uploaded there. Typically, the iOS, I would normally have the version and TLs and everything in the name, but these were all beta codes, so I didn't do that. All right, you can then do an ls-rep, and it gives you a list of what's in the repository. So here you can see that each of these images that's listed in there is actually also listed here. And right now where it says optical, you'll see it says none. That means that none of these images are allocated to any LPAR. Now this does require vSCSI, so you do have to have a vSCSI connection to each of your LPAR. In my case, I made sure that I actually created an FBO connection. And you do that here. You do a make vdev-fbo-vadapter, and then you give it the vhost. and then it creates all these VT ops. So in my case, on my Power 8, I have 4 VT ops. I only have 4 LPAs, so I know which one is which. So I could allocate any image that I wanted to one of those VOPs. So if you look here I'm doing a load opt to VT opt 0 of a particular image. And I can then, on the LPAR, just do a mount of slash. I can, do a SMIDI and like look at it, or I can do a mount of slash CD-ROM if I've created a slash CD-ROM mount for file systems, and I can look at the data. If I want to remove an image, I can RMV opt it. I can LSV opt it to list the state of the VT ops and so on. So there's a bunch of things you can do. Someone once described file-backed optical to me as a poor man's NIM, and I definitely like it as a way to keep ISO images very, very close by, because a lot of them have gone, you can't get them anymore. If you're looking for a 5.3 DVD, good luck. But at least this way you could rip them to ISO images and keep them somewhere safe. And this is just showing you the stuff that we just looked at on my Power 8. So there's a number of FBO commands. You can change the size of your repository. You can change virtual optical settings. There's man pages for all of these. Obviously, if you've used load opt to make one available to an image, to a VT opt, then you use unload opt to remove it. And there's also a help command, so you could do a help on any command. If I was to do a help on unload opt, it actually tells me that it's going to unload that virtual media from that optical device and what the syntax is. And then obviously as root, there's a couple of commands. One is the lsvg, which you can also run as padmin, but make VGU run as root. There are some additional commands that a lot of people aren't aware of. One of them is that you can get a command history on your VIO server. So if I run fc-l, for instance, it gives me the last 20 odd commands that I've entered. I can also run lsgcl, and that will give me the global command log. So that's going to show me here all the commands that were typed in as global commands. So you may want to, if you're interested in auditing or something like that, then you may want to do that. Also, a lot of people, because it's a restricted shell, there's a lot of commands that you can't use. So let's say that you want to redirect output and you're running as padmin. That's actually restricted, but you can actually do this lsmap with a T. So here I've run the command, and you can see I now have mpiv data.txt. There's also vscsi commands. I put these in because I can never remember the syntax. So you've got the make vdev here. This is how I make a disk available to a vhost. Same with the FBO. For mpiv, obviously you've got to set up the mappings. And then there's the vfcmap command. You have to do this to each of the fiber adapters that you want to connect to. And obviously for each fiber adapter you have to have a VFC host. So if your LPAR needs to connect to 4 fiber adapters, you're going to have 4 VFC hosts for that LPAR. lsmap-all lists most of the mappings, but to get the MPIV mappings you have to add -MPIV. You can be a little bit more restrained than that. So you can actually limit what you look at. You could do like an lsmap of a specific V adapter, and that's probably the way you're going to want to actually do it. Then you've also got the lsdev-virtual. I happen to like lsn ports. That's what you want to look at, is to find out if you actually have ports that support MPIV, because the switch may not necessarily support it. So you can see I have a list here of the ports. I've got 1 fiber adapter, and it lists the ports and the available worldwide port numbers and so on. And then you can actually do a lscfg on a VFC host as well. That's going to be a AIX command. So if you do an lsdev-virtual, here you can see all the different adapters, and it's listing only the virtual ones. You can see my VFC hosts, my V hosts, and so on. VFC hosts are your virtual fiber channels, so that's your MPIV. Your V hosts are your virtual SCSIs, and your VT ops are your file-backed opticals. If you do an lsmap-v adapter on a particular V host, it's going to show you everything that's allocated to it. So in this case, I'm being bad, I'm using a logical volume as my backing device. Normally I give it a whole H disk. If you want to do LPM, you must give it a whole H disk. And then I happen to have a virtual optical here, and in fact for some reason it has two virtual opticals, don't ask me why. Here I'm looking at a specific VFC host, and you can see that I don't have any adapters logged in here, but when I look at VFC host 4, I actually have fiber adapter FCS0 is logged in. So that's what you're looking for to see if you've actually got the connection. And of course it gives me my LPAR number, my LPAR name, and if it can figure it out, it tells you the operating system. Example again of the LSM ports. And then if you do the LSDev minus slots, it actually gives you all of the different slots, what they're assigned to. So these are going to be the adapter slots that are used for these. Some of the commands you can use on your VIO server. Now, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the HMC, and one of the reasons for doing that is because a lot of people don't realize you can actually SSH to your HMC. And there are reasons why you would and would not want to do that, but there are times when you actually need to. So I wanted to show you some of the useful commands for the HMC. So as an example, one of the commands, before you upgrade your HMC to version 8, you are supposed to check that you have enough memory. And so one of the ways you can do that is with the mon HMC here, -r-mem, mem-n space 0, and it actually tells me, for some reason it thinks I have 41 gig. I think there's a bug in the V8 code, because I'm pretty sure I don't have 41 gig. 1, 2, 3, oh no, sorry, that's 4 gig. So just be aware of that. On my Power 8 HMC, it's actually telling me I have 41 gig. You can also run a bunch of other commands. For instance, sometimes if you want to do the upgrade online, you can actually get the upgrade files. Those upgrade files you can get from the internet with the get upgrade files command. Once you do that, then you're going to have to make sure that first of all you have enough file system space for them. So you can do that with the mon HMC -r disk-n0, and this actually shows you like what the utilization is of your file systems. You can also do an LSHMC FS, which will also list the file systems, but it does it in a very ugly way. At least this way you get it in something that you're more familiar with. And I just look at the percents used. If you start to see that some of these numbers are up there, then you can actually clear that space, basically here saying clear out all the temp files. And then obviously there's the LSHWRES, which is used to list hardware resources. And then there's the LSHMC. And for those of you that don't know how to get an ASCII console, I've had a lot of problems with the web browsers because when I try to open a console, depending on what my Java is doing, it may block me. But I have the ability to literally run VT menu in an SSH shell, pick the server I want to go to, and then pick the LPAR that I want to open a console on. And I've now got a login prompt. And then to get out of it, it's a shift-tilde-dot, and you terminate the session and you quit out. That shift-tilde-dot's really important to remember. But I do a lot of installs where instead of using the console from that horrible black ASCII thing, this is still an ASCII console, but because I'm doing it through a really nice SSH shell, I can resize it, and I get a cleaner interface. And I've found that when I install Linux on Power in particular, it's a much, much better interface for doing that. So I almost never use a console. I normally VT menu from the HMC. There's a bunch of other commands here for looking at how much CPU usage and how much swap space and so on that you have. And these are just examples that I was just showing you of what these look like. So here I'm looking at my processors, and one of the things that was interesting is I ran this on my Power 7 HMC, which is my CR6, and so that's got 4 cores, and it says 4 gig of memory. I'm pretty sure I upgraded it though, so it was a bit of a surprise. And then I went to my Power 8 one, and this is the one that seems to think it has 40 gig of memory, which I know it doesn't. But I've actually got 6 processors. So They've added some cores to the CR7. And then, of course, the new HMC is a CR8, so that's going to be an upgrade again. From the LSHMC point of view, there's a whole bunch of different commands you can run. You don't have to hang over that highlight or whatever on the GUI, because there's two different ways I can look at the version of my HMC. One of them is to go into HMC management on the GUI, and then you hang over the version, and it gives you this information telling me which APARs I've put on. So I'm at the very, very latest 1441, and I can see my BIOS. But it's very hard to grab that if you're trying to keep it for documentation. If I do the LSHMC-V here, it gives me my version, my service pack, it gives me my HMC build level, it gives me my fixes, and then I can do, I think it's a -B, gives me my BIOS level. So I could actually run commands on here and grab that documentation, which is kind of nice. And there's a bunch of different commands, so I just put the help here for you so that you have that. So here I did the version, I did the lowercase v to show you that it gives me the serial number and all that kind of stuff in here. The BIOS, so I just gave you some examples of them. Also, if you want to check those LMB sizes, you can run on the HMC, you can run this lshwres command against each of your servers, and it will tell you what that LMB size is. It calls it mem region size, but so you could run that against each of the servers. So if you look here, when I went into VT menu, it listed me the names of each of my servers. I could run that command against all three of them and make sure they all had the same memory region size. And then I know I'm good to do LPM. I talked about doing HMC updates. Again, most people will do them through the GUI, but when I'm doing an actual upgrade, I don't like to use the DVD because I'm typically doing them remotely. So the first thing I always do is a save upgrade data. This is what we used to call a critical console update. And I save that to disk. Now what you used to be able to do was then back up your management console to a DVD. But if you look at what it says on, oops, wrong one, on the GUI now, backup management console data, you only have a choice of to a remote system or a remote site. The only thing you can save to DVD is the upgrade data. Well, I save that to hard drive and then I want to back up the whole HMC. So I typically now back it up to an FTP server. So I'll do the save upgrade data, then I'll back this up to an FTP server, then I'll do the get upgrade files, and so you can go to ftpsoftwareibm.com or publicdheibm.com. Now what I'm getting here is I was on version 778 and I wanted to go to 8810. So you can do the get upgrade files and tell it to download everything from 8810. Then you open a second SSH to the VIO server, and with that SSH you're going to do an ls-la on HMC dump. While it's downloading, you'll see files getting downloaded, you'll see some images and so on. As soon as it's finished, it'll come back with nothing. At that point, if you're sure that the other one worked, that it didn't fail or anything else, you can change the HMC to do an alternate disk boot and an upgrade. Then when you reboot, it's going to do the upgrade. And that will take it to the base of 8810. At that point, you then put on any updates or fixes. And IBM differentiates where you download fixes and service packs from. So I've put the three different things in here so that if you want to then go and use the GUI to do the updates and fixes, you can do that. You do that through the updates on the GUI here. You'd click on Update HMC, you'd tell it to a remote server, you'd give it the server name, and then you have to give it the actual directory you're going to upgrade from. Then when you get to that directory, it's going to give you a list of the options. So typically in the README, let's say you're putting on MH01441, you're going to look for MH01441 and select that. The thing that's very frustrating is that you have to do them one after another, and each one requires a reboot, and those reboots can take 20 to 30 minutes. So if you're planning on updating your HMCs, you should allocate a bunch of time for it. I'm a huge fan of the HMC scanner. The latest one I think is 11, and it provides a huge amount of information. So the way I run it is I run it from AIX. The reason I don't run it from my Windows system is because the Java just is a mess. So I'll actually go to one of my AIX systems and run it. And I actually don't use the dash sanitized anymore because it gets rid of everything that I care about. So I'll run hmcscanner.kshell, the server name, hsc root, -p password -stats. What I will typically do is run this as a script if I have more than one HMC, and I'll hit them all at the same time and then just blank out the passwords in the script. So here's an example of what I did. So it says it's running it and so on, and then I have the HMC scanner reports here. So it's telling me, here's my HMC, blah blah. Here's the specs of my HMC, the model, the serial number, the fixes that are applied to it, gives you all of those. It then gives me all my networking information, gives me a summary of all my systems, how many cores, how many are active, how many gigs, how many are active, all that kind of stuff. And it gives you current available and a bunch of other information, more than you really care to see. It also gives you the firmware levels with the EC, the IPL, so I'm at 730.122.122. Then it gives me the L path, and where it can, I figure it out. It tells me the operating system version. If they're not active, obviously it can't do that. It gives me how my CPU, etc., is set up, so I know what pools everything's in. And it also gives me the entitlement to VP ratio, and we could talk about that. Well, actually, I have a presentation up on the movie site that actually talks about entitlement to VP ratios. You should just be aware that you need to pay attention to those. Then it gives you all the memory setups and it gives you all the physical slots, so I actually know who has what slots allocated to them. And then the stuff I really like is when you start to get into the virtual Ethernet, but more importantly, the virtual SCSI. So this actually gives me all my virtual SCSI, all the slots, what's allocated where, and what the connections are. But then it gives me a vSCSI map. And to me, that map is really important because it is a nightmare if you ever have to rebuild this stuff, trying to figure out what went where. And buried in here are like all of the UUIDs and so on that you need if you had to rebuild this. And then it gives you all your virtual fiber channel stuff as well, including worldwide port numbers. It documents your ECAs and how those are built, and more on your firewall channel. And then the software cores stuff is really helpful if you use shared processor pools a lot, because the kind of information it will give you, and I'm not using pools on here, but the kind of information it will give you is the pool size, how many are dedicated, and so on. And then it also gives you some information on VPs, etc., so you can make sure that you haven't overcommitted those. So that's an example of an HMC scanner report. I also ran one on my Power8 HMC. It's basically the same kind of thing. So it's definitely recognizing the Power8s, and you can see it's like keeping track of the LPARs, etc. So I do highly recommend that you look at running HMC scanner. For those of you that haven't run it, there's also the VIOS Advisor. And basically this became a product in 2.2.2. Right now today, with 2.2.3.3, it's still there. So you run the command PART-I and 10, and actually I think that runs for 30 minutes. For some reason the -10 is for 30. And then it produces a VIOS Advisor report. So once I run it, it creates a tar file. If I untar that tar file, it will actually create all these files, and you have to download the whole thing. It actually creates an nmon for that time period as well, and an XML file, and then you look at the XML file. And so here I have my XML file. Let's see if it'll let me look at it. Yeah, here we go. So this is the XML file. This VIO server was not busy, I'll tell you that now. But what the XML file is telling me again is the server model, the speed, how many cores. It's telling me my CPU capacity for the VIO servers, how much it's using. And what we're looking for, we want as many green check marks as possible. There's also these little information things, and you can click on the question mark and it gives you details about it. It gives me my fiber channel adapter. And if you see these red ones, so what it's telling me is I've got 3 gig of memory. It thinks I really need 4.25 gig of memory. And then it gives you a bunch of instructions for other things. And then down here, there's something it doesn't like about my SEA. So it's upset that I have large receive disabled on the physical adapter. So it's telling me I need to go in and do that. So it really does give you a lot of information. The next few slides are some examples that I got from a customer, just giving you a lot more detail because this was obviously a much busier system. So you can see that it gave a lot of information on CPU capacity. This is a Power 6 that they were entitled to 10. It gave information on the actual free CPU. What I liked was it gave disk I/O and network I/O capacity, so we could figure out that they were, 229 IOPS, but they peaked at 1916. And then again, with the network I/O, it gave us an idea of what their networking was going on. And again, then it broke it down by disk adapters, disk drives, and so on. So you can see a lot of information. In their case, it actually recommended 7 gig of memory versus 4. That was because of the number of high-speed adapters that they had. I also put in this slide on SSP limitations. And the reason I did that is a lot of people are looking at shared storage pools, and so there are some minimum requirements that you need to know about them. The VIOS 2233 README has a lot of information on it. I took this right out of there, where it talked about before you do anything, all your VIO server nodes have to be at 2213. And then if you are in a shared storage pool, you have to shut down the shared storage pool. Well, if you're shutting down shared storage pool services, that means you shut down the LPARs that are using the shared storage pools. This has actually just got some of the limitations or maximums that you have with shared storage pools, so number of client LPARs per VIO server, capacity of the disks, etc. This is all in the README, but I thought I'd put it on a slide for you to make it easy to find. So I have a bunch of references here for you, a number of links. There is actually, I wrote a couple of articles for the IBM Systems magazine, which you can find here. And there's a VIO server maintenance part 1 and part 2. And then there are some VIO server-specific references, specific procedures for STD and STD PCM for the VIO server. As I said, the README, these Power VM virtualization red books are excellent. There's also the performance guides. So I recommend looking at all of these. I know it takes a lot of time to read them, but in particular the READMEs, and if you use STD PCM, this will keep you out of trouble. With that said, I want to thank you all for your time. The handouts are currently uploaded at the circle4.com papers, the viosmaint.pdf. If you do have a problem getting them, you can drop me an email at lynchj@forsyth.com.